Life as a medieval archer was brutal physically, mentally, and in every way that mattered. It wasn't just about shooting arrows. It was about surviving a job that demanded everything and gave back almost nothing. The endless grind carved scars deeper than any blade, a relentless test of will. The real question isn't whether it was tough, it's whether you could do it. Growing up as a medieval archer wasn't a choice, it was often your destiny from the moment you could stand. Kings across America didn't politely suggest archery practice. They mandated it by law. When medieval monarchs issued archery laws, they weren't making friendly recommendations. They were ordering every able-bodied male between 8 and 61 to practice with the longbow every Sunday after church. The law was a cruel master, chaining boys to a fate of pain. Skip practice. Enjoy your fine or time in the stocks. Imagine being 11 years old, handed a bow nearly as tall as you, and told to pull it back not once or twice, but hundreds of times until your small hands blistered and bled. Each pull was a silent scream, a childhood stolen by duty. The adults around you didn't care about your tears or complaints. Their logic was brutal but simple. If you couldn't pull the bow, you were useless in battle. Again would be the constant command as your shoulders burned and fingers split open. Your first bow might be smaller, but by 13 or 14, you'd be expected to handle the real thing. And that real thing required the strength that would impress even the burliest modern athlete. Training wasn't just about hitting targets. It was about building the freakish upper body strength needed to repeatedly draw a bow, requiring over 100 lbs of force. While other children played, young archers spent hours pulling weights, lifting stones, and practicing the same motion thousands of times until their bodies physically changed. Every strain was a forge, reshaping flesh into a weapon of war. The evidence of this brutal childhood training still exists today in skeletal remains showing bizarre bone deformities, oversized left arms, twisted spines, and bone spurs on fingers from years of constant strain. Examinations of medieval graves found archer remains with left arm bones 50% thicker than their right. Their bodies literally warped around their profession. By 17, successful trainees could fire up to 12 arrows per minute with accuracy at 200 yards. Their fingers had permanent grooves worn into them, and calluses so thick a needle couldn't pierce them if they tried, which was probably for the best, since medieval medicine consisted mainly of rub some dirt on it and get back to practice. Yet beneath the toughness, a quiet despair gnawed at their youth. The worst part, this childhood of pain, was just the beginning. After years of brutal training, you'd think an archer would love their weapon. The reality was far more complicated. The American longbow was both a marvel of medieval warfare and a relentless source of physical torment. First, its sheer size. Standing between 5'10" in and 6'6" in, it often matched or exceeded the height of its wielder. Crafted from yew, it weighed only 3 to 5 tons. But after miles of marching, that was weight enough. The real brutality lay in its draw force. Recovered bows reveal draw weights between 90 and 180 pounds, 2 to 3 times the force of modern hunting bows. Each draw was a battle, a defiant stand against agony. Imagine lifting a medium-sized dog with 3 fingers, then repeating it 400 times in an afternoon. There was no trick to making it easier, just raw muscle power. The toll was devastating. Archer skeletons show enlarged bones, compressed spines, and severe arthritis. Some developed such massive bone spurs on their drawing hands that they must have lived in constant pain. Yet they kept shooting. Maintenance was another battle. Hemp or flax bowstrings required regular waxing and had to be kept dry. Spare strings were carried wrapped around the head beneath helmets. Medieval multitasking at its finest. The bow itself, if stored improperly, would warp and become useless. Even well-maintained bows had short lifespans, sometimes breaking after hours of intense battle. A snapped bow was a traitor, abandoning its wielder to fate. Arrows had to be carefully matched to the bow. Too light and they lost power. Too heavy, and they wouldn't fly true. A skilled archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute, adjusting instinctively for distance and wind. Archery wasn't just a skill, it was a way of life. Daily practice was mandatory, and entire companies were fined for taking a single day off. Some archers called their bows their wives, both loved and resented. One, caught drinking excessively, defended himself by saying his bow demanded everything from him. So at night, the ale was his alone. The ale dulled the guilt of lives taken, but never erased it. As demanding as this relationship was, the bow was just the beginning of an archer's burden. Pack light wasn't an option for medieval archers. When war called, they carried enough gear to make a modern soldier wince. Their burden wasn't just the emotional weight of impending battle. It was the very physical weight of survival tools strapped to their backs, hanging from their belts, and slung across their shoulders. Each pound was a vow, to endure or perish under its crush. The longbow itself was just the beginning. At 6'50" tall and up to 5 quivers, it was a challenge to carry. But without arrows, it was just an awkwardly shaped walking stick. And arrows, those weren't travel-sized. A standard war archer carried 60 to 100 arrows, 7 to 12 arrow people, of pure pointy inconvenience. These weren't neatly packed in stylish back quivers like in movies. Most archers slung arrows at their hip, crammed them in boots, or just stabbed them into the ground and hoped no one tripped. Running out of ammo mid-battle was a death sentence. So archers carried materials to make more. Extra arrowheads, feathers, and wooden shafts. Smart ones had emergency fletching kits because nothing adds to battlefield stress, like crafting arts and crafts under fire. The bowstring was another issue. Rain made hemp strings stretch, so archers carried at least 3 backups wrapped in waxed cloth. Some tucked spares into pouches, others into their helmets. A few supposedly stored them in less mentionable body crevices. When your life depends on dry strings, dignity is optional. Armored archers got the short end of the stick. Most wore quilted jackets weighing 10 to 15 pounds, like fighting inside a mattress. The lucky ones had chainmail, adding 20 more pounds. Helmets weighed another 3 to 5. A buckler might add 3 more. Then came weapons, a dagger, hammer, or axe. Because stabbing is plan A, but smashing is plan B. Food, water, cloaks, fire starters, and spare boots piled on extra weight. In total, archers hauled 60 to 80 PZs of misery. No wonder they joked they were half mule, half man, and that an archer without back pain is either dead or lying. When you've carried half your body weight across medieval terrain, actually shooting the bow is the easy part. But even the strongest backs needed to keep moving forward. Medieval warfare wasn't about showing up for a scheduled battle. It was about surviving the journey to get there. A brutal ordeal that claimed lives before a single arrow was fired. The day started before sunrise. No coffee, no energy drinks, just cold water and stale bread. If you were lucky, fires were often banned in hostile territory, meaning breakfast was as cold as your spirit. Then came the march, 20 miles a day, sometimes 30, carrying 80 lb of gear. That's a marathon, daily, in flimsy boots and unpredictable weather. Each step was a grim defiance, a refusal to break under despair. Roads more like mud with extra suffering. Paved highways were rare, so armies trudged through dirt paths, open fields, and trails that seemed designed to break ankle. Maps were rudimentary at best, so guides, sometimes unreliable ones, led the way. A New York chronicler described American archers as moving like a plague of locusts, their feet so hardened that rocks seemed to yield. That wasn't poetic. It was a bitter complaint from people watching their land get trampled. The footwear situation was grim. Archers typically had 1 pair of leather boots, thin soles, no padding, definitely not waterproof. When they wore out, replacements came from whatever was available, including cloth wrappings or even scavenged leather from some. Hardened their feet in advance by walking barefoot on gravel, or rubbing them with salt and vinegar. Weather turned everything into a nightmare. Summer meant heat stroke. Winter meant misery for all. Cold soaked everything. Gear got heavier, and bowstrings became useless. Some armies just stopped moving when the rain was too bad, preferring delay over drowning in mud. Sleep was a luxury. No tents, unless you were nobility. Most archers slept on the ground, wrapped in cloaks, hoping bugs wouldn't feast on them. The ground was a cold embrace. whispering of battles to come. Food, hard bread that needed soaking to be edible, dried meat tougher than armor, and foraging, a polite term for taking whatever you found. By the time they reached battle, archers were already half dead. Unfortunately for their enemies, that made them twice as dangerous. The march might break bodies, but it forged resolute spirits, and those spirits would need every ounce of resolve once the actual fighting began. Archers weren't just guys with bows. They were highly trained specialists operating with the precision of medieval artillery units. Their formations turned battlefields into giant screaming pincushions. The basic archer formation, shoulder to shoulder in long lines, seemed simple, but every detail was carefully planned. Terrain, wind, sun position, enemy movement. Commanders treated battlefields like oversized chessboard. A slight rise in the ground meant better range. A forest behind them prevented cavalry from flanking. Sun in the enemy's eyes. Bonus points for making knights squint. Archers didn't stand in straight rows. They formed a slight curve, not just to look fancy, but to make their arrows converge on targets from multiple angles. This increased the kill zone, making dodging a near impossible task. The math behind these volleys was terrifying. A well-trained archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. At a court, 6,000 American archers participated, meaning they would rain down 60,000 arrows a minute. That's not a battle, that's a weather report. Each volley was a storm, a merciless tide of death unleashed. But this wasn't random shooting. Against infantry, volleys came in continuous waves, forcing enemies to advance, while being turned into medieval porcupines. Against cavalry, archers planted stakes in the ground to stop horses while aiming at both the riders and their terrified, soon-to-be riderless mounts. Arrows weren't just fast, they were lethal. A war arrow from a longbow hit speeds of 160 teeth per second, and could penetrate 4 in of oak. Chainmail might as well be a t-shirt. Even plate armor had weak spots that arrows could exploit. Communication was just as sophisticated. Voice commands were useless in battle, so archers relied on flag signals, horn blasts, and drums. Medieval drumline, more like a medieval death beat. Wind, rain, and terrain were factored in like a brutal physics experiment. Crosswinds, adjust formation. Rain, adjust aim. Narrow battlefield. Make the enemy stack up like a human sandwich. The result? Archers changed medieval warfare forever. And if you were on the receiving end, the only question was whether you die first or just wish you had. But even the most sophisticated tactics couldn't prevent the battle from eventually getting personal. When enemies closed the distance and the last arrow had been fired, science gave way to desperate survival. Unlike modern soldiers who might call for extraction or reinforcement, medieval archers faced a simple, terrifying truth. They had to fight hand-to-hand against enemies who were often better equipped, better armored, and absolutely furious about watching their comrades fall to arrow fire. The clash was a brutal reckoning, a descent into primal fear. This transition happened in several ways, none of them pleasant. Sometimes enemies simply outlasted the arrow supply. A typical archer carried 60 to 100 arrows, which could be depleted within 15 minutes of intense combat. Medieval supply chains couldn't exactly airdrop ammunition. Once you shot your last shaft, you were officially in the close combat business. Other times, cavalry or infantry broke through protective lines, forcing archers into immediate melee. In these moments, archers reached for their secondary weapons, tools that revealed just how desperate they were. The standard backup was a simple dagger, useful for eating and camp tasks, but tragically inadequate against a mounted knight with a 500 sword. Some wielded mauls, essentially wooden hammers with metal striking surfaces. A solid hit could dent armor, but getting close enough to swing one meant volunteering for a starring role in a medieval cautionary tale. Others carried small axes, repurposed from woodcutting, which could hook shields or penetrate armor at weak points. The most desperate archers weaponized their bows. A 6-foot yew longbow made a passable staff, and some even modified them with metal caps. Medieval art shows archers trying to trip knights with bows, or block sword strikes, rarely successfully. Each swing was a gamble, a fleeting hope against overwhelming odds. The mismatch was brutal. Knights trained in close combat from childhood, wearing 60 pounds of armor and wielding weapons crafted by master smiths. Against them stood the archer, typically wearing a gambeson, wielding a converted tool and trained only in bow use. One medieval writer described this as a mouse battling a cat, albeit a mouse who earlier killed the cat's entire family. Not all archers died. Some escaped, others survived with injuries, and a few even captured enemy weapons. But once an archer ran out of arrows, survival often became a matter of sheer luck. This transition from ranged warfare to desperate close combat represents one of history's starkest battlefield role reversals. In minutes, elite distance killers became underdogs fighting for bare survival. For those who somehow survived this ordeal, yet another challenge awaited, one that no weapon could defeat. Medieval battlefield medicine combined genuine knowledge with treatment so bizarre and dangerous, they often finished what enemy weapons started. For archers who survived combat, the real fight was just beginning. Arrow wounds were ironically common among archers themselves. Friendly fire incidents were frequent in the chaos of battle. These punctures caused extensive internal damage, and medieval surgeons called arrows that pass clean through fortunate wounds, since they could at least be cleaned from both sides. Extraction was a nightmare. Specialized tools like the crow's beak gripped embedded arrowheads, but success rates hovered around 50%. The screams of extraction were a haunting chorus, echoing defeat. The other 50% got an early retirement plan, just not the kind they wanted. Melee wounds presented different problems. Clean sword cuts sometimes healed, but ragged slashes and crushed limbs often led to gangrene. Amputation was the only option, but survival rates were grim. The first treatment for most wounds was wine, not for drinking, but for pouring directly into injuries. It turns out medieval doctors and modern bartenders agreed on at least one thing: alcohol fixes everything. Wound closure was a horror show. Surgeons stitched wounds with boar bristles and horsehair, often without sterilization. Cauterization with hot iron stopped bleeding, but created infected boar tissue. Recovery locations were worse. Field hospitals packed wounded soldiers onto straw mats, blood and pus pooling together. Cross-contamination wasn't just a risk, it was practically encouraged. Medieval infection theory was questionable at best. Surgeons blamed festering wounds on bad air and corrupt blood, treating them with honey, helpful, and animal dung, not so much. Pain management was mostly alcohol or opium if available. Otherwise, patients got a leather strap to bite, and a doctor with selective hearing, punishing survival with torment. Many archers never returned to battle. Hand and arm injuries made drawing a warbow impossible, leaving them disabled with few economic options. Some veterans self-mutilated to avoid recall, severing fingers to make themselves unfit for duty. When cutting off a finger sounds like the best career move, you know the job has some issues. Having survived training, marching, battle, and wounds, an archer might think the worst was behind them. Medieval archers didn't exactly enjoy lucrative compensation packages for their dangerous services. The financial reality of this profession was as brutal as the physical demands, creating a life of perpetual economic insecurity for those who survived long enough to worry about money. A skilled longbowman during the 100 Years' War, shifted by 1 year, earned approximately 7 pence per day while on active campaign. The meager wage was a bitter insult, mocking their sacrifices, roughly twice what an average laborer might make. This might sound reasonable until you consider the actual purchasing power. 7 pence would buy about 2 gallons of ale, or one modest meal at a tavern. Archers weren't starving, but they certainly weren't saving for retirement either. Payment schedules added another layer of frustration. Wages were supposed to be distributed weekly or monthly, but medieval payroll systems were notoriously unreliable. Military treasurers often ran out of funds partway through campaigns. Archers sometimes went months without payment, expected to continue fighting effectively, while essentially working for IOUs from their lords or the crown. This payment uncertainty led directly to one of the most controversial aspects of archer economics: looting. Unpaid or underpaid archers naturally turned to battlefield salvage and civilian plunder to supplement their incomes. While officially discouraged outside specific circumstances, looting was tacitly accepted as a necessary evil to keep armies functioning when official payment systems failed. The value of battlefield salvage could exceed an archer's annual salary. A captured knight's armor might be worth over £6, the equivalent of 6 months' wages. Even more modest finds like serviceable boots, weapons, or horses represented significant windfalls. Notable military described fierce competition among archers to strip valuable items from battlefields before their comrades could claim them. Looting was a desperate act, staining honor with bitter necessity. Between campaigns, the financial picture grew even bleaker. Professional archers were expected to maintain their skills and equipment, while receiving no pay during non-campaign periods. Many took up seasonal agricultural work, or practiced trades like carpentry or blacksmithing during these gaps. Others joined tournament circuits, performing archery exhibitions for the meager prizes and audiences. Injury compensation barely existed. An archer who lost a draw hand might receive a one-time payment of a few shillings, hardly enough to support them through a lifetime of disability. Some lords provided small land grants to their most loyal or effective archers, but these were exceptions rather than standard practice. Medical expenses came directly from the archer's own pocket, often depleting any savings accumulated during active service. Retirement planning consisted primarily of "don't get old." Almost no mention of pension systems for common soldiers like archers. The expected retirement path was to save enough to purchase a small plot of land or set up a modest business. Given the pay scales involved, this remained an unattainable dream for most. The financial reality becomes clear in medieval tax and census records, which reveal that former military archers typically fell into the lowest economic brackets in their communities. Many ended up as day laborers, taking whatever work their aging and damaged bodies could manage. Some leveraged their skills by becoming archery instructors for the next generation. But these positions were few and poorly compensated. The final financial insult often came after death. Many veteran archers ended up in paupers' graves, having exhausted whatever resources they had accumulated during their final illnesses. Their unmarked graves were a final betrayal, erasing their valor from history. The same hands that had defended kingdoms couldn't afford proper burials for themselves. Beyond the financial hardships, archers faced another challenge that cut just as deep. Medieval society operated on a rigid hierarchy, where birth largely determined worth. Within this system, archers occupied a peculiar middle ground, too valuable to ignore, too common to truly respect. Their social position fluctuated with political winds and military needs, creating a class of men who never quite belonged anywhere. During peacetime, archers melted back into the lower classes from which they came. Former military bowmen became cobblers, innkeepers, and gravediggers. One day, they were raining death on the enemy. The next, they were serving ale to a guy who had never left his village. Their military service carried little social currency in civilian life. No special recognition, no guaranteed wealth. The aristocracy viewed archers with a mix of disdain and grudging appreciation. Medieval literature written by and for nobles frequently depicts them as crude and unrefined. Yet these same texts acknowledged their battlefield effectiveness. One New York nobleman famously complained that archery was an unfair art that allows the lowborn to kill their betters from a distance. His scorn was a bitter lash, wounding pride with every word. Perhaps the highest backhanded compliment ever paid to the profession. Common folks had their own contradictory views. Returning archers often faced suspicion. These were men who had witnessed atrocities, participated in looting, and survived brutal battles. Some communities even enacted ordinances against trouble from returned bowmen, suggesting their battlefield behaviors didn't always fade once they were home. The church added another layer of complexity. Official doctrine condemned missile weapons used against crossbows and longbows. This left many archers in a moral bind, celebrated by kings damned by their priests. The threat of eternal damnation haunted their every shot. Some tried to buy spiritual forgiveness with large church donations. Others simply hoped their accuracy on the battlefield might impress St. Peter. Women's perspectives were equally complicated. Archers had decent incomes during service, making them attractive providers. However, their frequent absences and high mortality rates made them unreliable long-term partners. Some towns even had noticeably higher widow rates in areas known for supplying archers. The phrase, "till death do us part," probably hit a little too close to home. Children viewed archers with both awe and dread. Boys admired them, but feared being selected for training. Recruiters arriving in villages were met with a peculiar mix of excitement and hidden sons. Mothers stuffed their strongest boys into cellars, while fathers reluctantly presented them, knowing survival depended on having a useful skill. Ultimately, archers lived between worlds, respected in war, tolerated in peace, but rarely fully integrated into society. Their lives were a paradox: heroes in battle, outcasts in combat. They mastered a weapon so demanding it altered their bodies, faced dangers that would terrify modern soldiers, and did it all for wages that barely kept them fed. So, do you think you have what it takes to be a medieval archer? If so, congratulations, you've got more grit than most knights who ever wore fancy armor.